So this module is called Beyond the Smart, and Danny and I both agree that it is not a good name. And you'll see in a second why. So why did we have this module from the first place? This is the first time that we do this module in this training. And it started because last year, the focus was on smarts, but then the participants, the scholars, started asking questions and integrating other types of designs in addition to the smart. They wanted to integrate additional designs in the smart or do them separately. And these included the micro-randomized trials and also hybrid designs. We talked about hybrid designs a little bit yesterday. So we decided to give you a very brief overview of two additional experimental approaches, micro-randomized trials and hybrid design. So when I say hybrid, everybody, I don't mean hybrid effectiveness implementation, right? It's not about blending effectiveness and implementation. It's about blending different optimization trials. Okay, I'm going to talk about this in a second. And the most important thing that I want you to get out of this is to see the connection between the SMART and the MRT and the hybrid designs, okay? So what I'll do is I'll repeat a few concepts that we already talked about yesterday, but I want you to bear with me because I have an agenda, okay? So, okay, let me stand here. That would be easier. I'm going to start by reviewing adaptive interventions again, okay? But now the reason I review it is because I want to show you that adaptive interventions, they typically guide the adaptation of human-delivered components on a relatively slow time scale. And slow time scale, I mean every few weeks or every few months, can be years, okay? Can be years. It depends on the problem. But for now, let's just focus on a few weeks or a few months, okay? And I'm going to review the SMART again very briefly, but the reason I'm going to do this is because I want to show you that SMARTs, they include randomizations, sequential randomizations on a slow time scale to match the slow time scale in which you adapt in adaptive interventions, okay? And I'll show you exactly how this works. And then I'll transition to talking about just-in-time adaptive interventions, or what we call JEDIs. Some people call it JETIs, but we call it JEDIs for obvious reasons. And I'll show you that JEDIs, what they do is they guide the adaptation of digital components on a fast time scale. And by fast, I mean every few days, hours, minutes, seconds. Okay, and I know it's relative, but let's just focus on days, hours, minutes, seconds. And then I'll talk about MRTs, micro-randomized trials, and I'll show you how MRTs can be used to answer questions about how to best construct JEDIs. And MRTs involve sequential randomizations on a fast time scale, because you're answering questions about a JEDI in which the adaptation happens on a fast time scale, okay? And then I'll talk about multi-modal adaptive interventions. Multi-modal adaptive interventions are just adaptive interventions in which human-delivered components and digital components are integrated, and they are adapted on multiple time scales, slow and fast. And I'll show you how the hybrid experimental design, it's a hybrid smart MRT, it's a combination of the two, how it can be used to answer questions about how to best construct multi-modal adaptive interventions, okay? Now, I'll say this later, but just to connect this to the discussion that we had yesterday, this is one hybrid design, the SMART and the MRT. Yesterday, we were talking about a hybrid design that combined the factorial design and the SMART. And this is another type of hybrid. But for now, today, we're only going to focus on one hybrid design, the combination of the SMART and the MRT. So far, so good? You ready to go? Okay. Distinction between an intervention delivery framework and an experimental design. We already know the difference between the two, but I want to emphasize that all this, adaptive interventions, JEDIs, multimodal adaptive interventions, these are intervention designs, intervention delivery frameworks, no randomizations. These are not experimental designs. All of these are guides for how we should adapt interventions, okay? These are experimental designs, the SMART, MRTs, hybrid designs. They have randomizations because we want to answer scientific questions about how to best construct different types of adaptive interventions. So far, so good? Another distinction that is important is between optimization and evaluation. And this is important here as well. All these trials, these are optimization trials. Okay? The goal of these trials is to help you build an intervention package. Select the components, figure out how to best integrate them so you would have an adaptive intervention, a JEDI or a multimodal adaptive intervention that is effective and resource efficient. And we do this before we take the car and compare it to other cars, compare it to a suitable control. Okay? So far, so good? All right, so now let's review adaptive interventions again. And I'm going to use a different example from before. By the way, all the examples that I'm going to show you today, they're based on work by Maureen Walton, but I modified them for illustrative purposes, so this is now how they were implemented in practice, okay? So what is an adaptive intervention? It's an intervention delivery framework. It's a guide for how practitioners should adapt interventions in practice, and the term adapt means use dynamic information about the person to decide whether and how to intervene, and that use has to be what? Empirically based and protocolized. Yes, thank you. Why do we need adaptation? We need adaptation because we practitioners, we want to be able to address not only the unique, but also the changing needs of people as they progress over time. And in standard adaptive interventions, the goal is to address conditions that change relatively slowly, every few months or weeks. That's why the adaptation happens on a slow time scale. And the adaptation here, these interventions, they typically guide the adaptation of human-delivered components. But they can also guide the adaptation of other components that can be adapted on a slow time scale. If we have time, I'll give you a few examples, okay? But for now, what I want you to look at is this adaptive intervention for youth in the emergency department. This intervention starts with a relatively minimal form of support, just a single session in the emergency department plus a digital intervention. I want to reduce their substance use when they visit the emergency department. And this is how we start. A single session and a digital intervention that provides tailored messages on a daily basis. That's all, through the mobile device. But then at week 4, we need to assess the participant's response status. If the participant self-reports to use drugs, at week 4, we classify them as non-responders, and we transition them to the next phase where they receive remote health coaching. Everybody, this is human-delivered coaching, okay? Otherwise, we continue with the same initial intervention. So there are 2 things that I want you to notice about this example. The first one, this intervention is adaptive. Why is it adaptive? Because we're using information about the person's response status at week 4 to decide whether or not to add coaching. We use dynamic information about the person to make intervention decisions, right? The second thing to notice, the adaptation here happens on a slow time scale. Look, it happens at week 4, 4 weeks after the emergency department visit. Remember, when we said slow, we said over a few weeks or every few months. So this happens on a slow time scale. Why are we adapting on a slow time scale? It's because we're trying to address conditions that change relatively slowly. You see here, we're trying to address early signs of non-response, which is expected to unfold over 4 weeks. That's why we adapt at week 4. That's why we adapt on a slow time scale. So this is trivial, right? But in many cases, we investigators, now we're the investigators, we have scientific questions about how to construct an adaptive intervention. Let me show you 2 questions that I have here about how to construct this adaptive intervention. You ready? The first thing that I don't know is actually how to initiate this intervention. When I saw this example, I was thinking, wait, this is very minimal support. I want to know if it's more beneficial in terms of reducing the number of substance use days by week 16 to actually add coaching, bring the coaching right off the bat. So first scientific question, how should we start? With or without coaching when this is our outcome? The second question that I have is how to best address the needs of non-responders. Here, the assumption is that I should add coaching for non-responders. But maybe it would be more beneficial simply to continue with the initial intervention. Just give them more time with the initial intervention. More beneficial, again, in terms of reducing the number of substance use days by week 16. Okay, I repeated the outcome that I'm focusing on about 3 or 4 times. And I sound like a broken record. But there's a reason why I did that. Actually, 2 reasons. One is that whenever we specify a scientific question, a good scientific practice is to also specify the outcome. And many people do that. They just specify a scientific question, but not the outcome. So there has to be an outcome when you have a scientific question. This is my outcome. The second reason is that this outcome is relatively distal, week 16 substance use. And I want you to don't notice this. I want this to be salient because later when I talk about questions for Jedis, I'm going to focus on an outcome that is proximal. And I want you, when I get to that point, to ask me why. Okay? You need to remember to ask me why. Why, when I have questions about Jedis, my outcome is proximal, and here my outcome is distal. Okay? All right. So how do we answer these questions? This is why we have the SMART. We know what the SMART is. It's a randomized trial. It's an experimental design that involves sequential randomizations. In the SMART, each stage of randomizations corresponds to a decision point in the adaptive intervention that you want to develop, in which you, the scientist, you have scientific questions about the selection and adaptation of components. You see, here, I don't know how to initiate my intervention with or without coaching. So what do? I randomize initially to the intervention with or without coaching. And then, what did I say? I don't know what to do for non-responders at week 4. So what do I do for non-responders? I re-randomize them to step up versus continue. My responders continue with the initial intervention. I'm not randomizing them. Why? Tell me why. Come on, you can do this. I'm not randomizing responders. Why? Look at my scientific questions. Look at them. Yeah. What is the assumption? I'm assuming that it's working. Do I have any scientific questions here about responders? I don't. I only want to know how to initiate it and what to do for non-responders. I did not specify any scientific questions about responders. It means that I'm assuming that it's working. I don't need to fix it. And I know exactly what to do for them. Just continue. If I had a scientific question about what to do for responders, I could have randomized responders. But what I want you to take out of this is that the randomizations in the SMART, they correspond to our scientific questions. They're not supposed to make things complicated just for the sake of making things complicated. They're supposed to help us answer scientific questions. I have 2 questions here about 2 decision points. What to do initially, what to do at week 4, only for non-responders. That's how I set up my randomizations. So far, so good? Yeah.
So you have 6 cells, but it's really just 4 different possible interventions that they received, right?
4 possible embedded adaptive interventions.
Yeah, okay.
Yes, you got this. Perfect. Yeah. All right, which brings me to an important point here. Yeah.
Since you've gone to the trouble of doing this and you're not randomizing those who continue, do you kind of owe it to the funders, to the participants, to do an extra randomization, to learn more about what you should do with those responders? Because you kind of get that from nothing, right?
Well, I think that we should never be motivated to do anything because we feel obligated. But don't tell my children that I said that. I think that it all has to come from your scientific questions. If you know what to do for responders, if it's not broken, why fix it? Because remember, everything comes with a cost. There are no free meals. If you randomize responders, you're complicating your design, right? Maybe it would have implications on sample size. And the question is it worth it? If you already know what to do, why bother? Why spend resources doing something that you already have evidence for? Does that make sense? If you don't have evidence for, that's completely fine. And here's another example. Sometimes what happens is that the rate of response is very low. Most people, 80%, are non-responders. So why should we randomize responders? Right? Would it make sense to randomize responders when you only have a few participants who are going to be responsive? Most of them are going to be non-responsive, right? If you randomize, what is it going to give you scientifically if you randomize 10 participants or 15 participants to two options? What can you learn with such a small sample? Does that make sense? So there are no free meals here. You always need to ask yourself, is it worth it? Do I have a scientific question here that can make an impact? If I answer it, will it have an impact? And is it worth the effort that I need to put and the resources that I need to put into integrating this in the design? Make sense? Okay, yeah.
If we had a scientific question about the ability to step down the intervention for responders,
yeah, you could. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So even though you don't have a question about responders, technically by the responders continuing, you are answering that first question, right? So
yeah.
We do have a question about responders.
Yeah,
right?
they contribute to the first question. And let me show you how. Okay, Danny's going to talk about this today. But I'll give you the intuition for how you answer the first scientific question. But before I do that, I wanted to emphasize the issue the aspect that I talked about earlier about the time scale of the randomizations. The time scale of the randomization here is slow. Okay? What does it mean, slow time scale for the randomizations? I'm randomizing initially and 4 weeks later. Slow time scale means that I'm randomizing only a few times in the course of the trial, and the length of the time interval between stages of randomizations is relatively long, a few weeks or a few months. Do you see that? The reason you randomize on a slow time scale in the SMART is because you're trying to answer questions about how to best construct an adaptive intervention in which the adaptation happens on a slow time scale. You see, there's a connection between how fast you want to adapt and how fast you need to randomize in the trial design that you're using to answer questions about that intervention. Do you see that? Okay. So let's talk about how do you analyze data from this trial to answer these two questions. And we're going to talk about this a lot today. I'm going to go over this really briefly. The first question is how to initiate this intervention with or without coaching. To answer this question, all you need to do is take the mean outcome of week 16 substance use across the 3 cells here, A through C, in which participants did not start with coaching, and compare it to the mean outcome in which participants started with coaching. You see that? It's just a comparison of half of your sample versus the other half. It's a main effect. It's the main effect of starting with coaching versus no coaching. You're averaging over second stage components for responders and non-responders. That's what you're doing. As simple as that. And by the way, that's how you size the trial. And Dennis is going to talk about this later. You size it like you size a 2-arm trial. That's it. Okay, but how do you answer the second question? The second question is what to do for non-responders at week 4. Step up or continue? To answer this question, again, I'm not going to be comparing individual cells. I'm going to take the mean outcome across cells B and E, where my non-responders got the step-up option, and I'll compare it to C and F, where my non-responders got the continue option. This is a comparison of half of my non-responders versus the other half. By the way, I always forget to say it. It's annoying. The reason I say half versus the other half is because throughout, I'm assuming the randomization probability is 0.5. Okay? So this, although this analysis is restricted only to non-responders, I would still use my entire sample of non-responders to estimate this effect. And it's okay that it's limited to non-responders. Guess why? And then we'll talk about this later. It's because the scientific question is restricted to non-responders. I only want to know what to do for non-responders, so I'm only using their data to answer this question. Just give me a second. I'm on a roll here. That's why. Okay, this is the main effect of the second stage options for non-responders, averaging over the first stage intervention options. Yes, question?
So even though your B and E second stage interventions are different.
Yeah.
Your question was like stepping up the intensity so we can compare those?
Yes, because
Okay.
these are two tactics. Yes, the treatment would differ depending on the initial intervention option, but it is the same tactic. And that's why it makes sense to collapse the data. And if you can't conceptualize that integration, what do I mean by conceptualize? If it doesn't make sense to look at them as to look at these two cells as representing the same tactic, then don't do that. Of course, don't do that. But here it does make sense because in both cases I'm stepping up. All right, ready to talk about Jedis?
I have one quick question.
Yeah.
So going back, can you go back to the slide?
No.
Going back to the previous discussion about randomization. So let's say we had a scientific question about responders, whether we want to step down,
Mm-hmm.
and then you find out after the first phase that you only have 10 responders. Would it be acceptable to decide then not to randomize because the answer is small?
Well, let me reframe this question. I think the question should be, how do we design a SMART in such a way that we can avoid a situation where very few participants end up being in a particular cell that we actually really need for answering the scientific question. And to do that, that's why we recommend a preparation phase where you conduct a pilot SMART, and this will help you figure out how many exactly will fall into, well, I wouldn't say exactly, but it would give you a good sense of how many would fall in each cell. And if when you conduct this pilot SMART, you realize that you only have a few responders, then I suggest that you do not re-randomize responders. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Let's talk about Jedis, my favorite topic. I know I shouldn't choose sides, but I do love these interventions. So what is a Jedi? A Jedi is just like an adaptive intervention. It's a guide for how we should adapt interventions in practice, how we should use dynamic information about the person to make intervention decisions. But Jedis, they're special. And that's why I like them. They're special because the adaptation happens on a fast time scale. Again, fast meaning every few days, hours, minutes, seconds. Why do we adapt on a fast time scale? It's because we want to address conditions that change relatively fast. And you see these conditions, they're not just changing fast, they're also changing in people's daily lives, outside of standard treatment settings. That's why Jedis typically guide the adaptation of digital components. Because with digital components, mobile devices, we can deliver interventions in daily life and we can adapt interventions rapidly. As an example, I want you to think about the digital intervention that youth received in the emergency department from the previous example. And suppose that as part of this digital intervention, every day we collect information about the person's state and context. Okay? We use ecological momentary assessments every day, EMAs, to ask them about their stress, their loneliness, their hopefulness. And we also use GPS to monitor the participant's location. And every day, if this combined information indicates that the person experiences high risk for next day substance use, we trigger a message with a protective behavioral strategy. You see that? Otherwise, we do nothing. We leave the person alone. You see the adaptation here? This is an adaptive intervention. I'm using dynamic information about the person's risk status every day to decide whether or not to trigger a message. I'm using dynamic information to make decisions. But now, here, the adaptation happens on a fast time scale. It happens every day. You see that? Why does it happen every day? It's because I'm trying to address conditions that change on a daily basis. I'm trying to address risk for next day substance use, which is expected to unfold on a daily basis. That's why I need to adapt on a fast time scale. That's why we need Jedis. Again, trivial, but in many cases, we investigators, we have scientific questions about how to construct a Jedi. And I want to share 2 questions that I have with you about this Jedi, okay? The first thing that I don't know here is about the general utility of a message that contains a protective behavioral strategy in reducing next day substance use. I don't know if this type of message, on average, would be beneficial compared to doing nothing and reducing next day substance use. The second question that I have is about the conditions in which this message would be most beneficial. You see, the assumption here is that I should trigger a message when risk is high. But maybe I should trigger a message when risk is moderate to high. I don't know. So I have two questions. Notice my proximal outcome, reducing next day substance use. Notice my proximal outcome, next day. What are you supposed to do? You're supposed to ask me a question. Why is it proximal here? Whereas when I had questions about adaptive interventions, the outcome was distal. What do you think? Why? Why is my outcome proximal? Give you a clue. Look at the interventions here. Look at the intervention here. It's a message. Compare that to coaching in my adaptive intervention. What is this supposed to impact when you trigger a message? If you trigger a message, is it supposed to lead to long-term effect? A message is likely to lead to a short-term effect, more immediate effect on people's behaviors and experiences. Whereas in adaptive interventions, we focus on components that are expected to lead to more longer-term effects, more distal effects on people's behaviors and experiences. That's why the focus of scientific questions that motivate the smart are on a more distal outcome. Whereas scientific questions that focus on optimizing Jedis, they concern the effects on a proximal outcome. Does that make sense?
It's the accumulation of the proximal outcomes.
I was hoping somebody would say that. Yes, exactly. It's the accumulation. But the effect itself of the message versus no message, which I'll show you in a second, that's on a proximal outcome. And again, it can be the proximal outcome. The benefits can accumulate over time, leading to improvement in a distal outcome. All right, so how do we answer these questions? This is why we have the micro-randomized trial.
Can I ask a quick question
Yeah.
about the Jedis? So would that be considered like a cluster type of analysis?
Let me show you. Okay. To answer these questions, this is why Susan Murphy and her team worked on developing the micro-randomized trial, the MRT. The MRT, just like the SMART, is a randomized trial that involves sequential randomizations. What does it mean, sequential randomizations? We talked about this before. It means that the same person can get randomized multiple times in the course of the trial. That's what we mean by sequential randomization. But MRTs are special. They're different from the SMART in the sense that the sequential randomizations happen on a fast time scale. What does it mean in practice? It means that the same person can get randomized many, many times in the course of the trial, hundreds or thousands of times, multiple times per day sometimes. And the length of the time interval between stages of randomizations is relatively short. For example, if I want to answer my two questions, what I can do is conduct a study where every day I collect data about the person's state and context with EMAs and with sensors. But instead of triggering a message when risk is high, because I don't know if I should, I randomize. See? The randomizations correspond to my scientific questions. I don't know if I should. I randomize to the message versus no message. And I do this every day. And following each day, I collect data on my outcome, next day substance use, on the next day's EMA. So far, so good? Notice, the randomizations, they happen on a fast time scale. Every day. Why? Because I want to answer questions about how to construct a Jedi in which the adaptation happens on a fast time scale. So again, see the connection between how fast we randomize and how fast we want to adapt. All right, so how do we use the data from this trial to answer these two questions? Let me show you very quickly, okay? Remember, the first question was about the general effectiveness, the general benefits of triggering a message with a protective behavioral strategy on next day substance use compared to doing nothing. To answer this question, all we need to do is take the mean outcome. Remember, the proximal outcome I collected on the next day following each randomization. So each randomization is connected to a proximal outcome. that I'm collecting. So what I'll do is I'll take the mean proximal outcome across all the days in which a message was sent across all participants, and I'll compare it to the mean outcome across all the days in which a message was not sent across all participants. That's it. That's all it is. This is the average proximal main effect of sending a message versus no message on next day substance use. It's average because I'm averaging over all the participants in the study and all the days in which they were microrandomized. And to estimate this effect, I will be leveraging both between person and within person contrasts in my outcome. And that's why MRTs are so efficient for answering questions about Jedis. Because in standard randomized trials, we're only leveraging between person contrasts. Whereas here, it's between and within. And of course, what I can also do is look at whether this effect changes with time. Because I can estimate this effect for each day. I can see if it varies with time. Maybe it dissipates with time, maybe not. And I can look at moderators of this effect. So I can look at the conditions in which a message is better than no message. Lots of really interesting scientific questions that we can answer here. I only have 5 minutes, and I gotta go through a few more slides. But I'll try to leave some more time for questions when I'm done. And if I don't have enough time, I promise that I'll stick around and we can answer questions. Thanks. All right, so now we're ready to talk about multimodal adaptive interventions because you know about adaptive interventions and you know about Jedis. And guess what? In many cases, investigators want to combine the two. You see, what I wanted to do here with Maureen, I wanted to take this adaptive intervention in which the delivery of coaching is adapted based on the participant's response status at week 4. But at the same time, I wanted this intervention that they get at the emergency department, the digital intervention, I wanted to adapt the delivery of the messages based on daily signs of risk. I wanted an intervention that does both. Adapts the human-delivered components on a slow time scale and the digital components on a fast time scale. In other words, we wanted to develop a multi-model adaptive intervention. A multi-model adaptive intervention, it's an intervention delivery framework that guides the adaptation of intervention components. But it's special because it guides the adaptation of both human-delivered and digital components that are adapted on multiple timescales, slow and fast. And you can think about it as an integration between 2 intervention designs, between a standard adaptive intervention and a Jedi. All right, but I can tell you that we have many, many scientific questions about how to construct these interventions, multimodal adaptive interventions. And I want to show you one scientific question that has been keeping me very busy over the past 5 years, okay? I want to know if there's a positive synergy between starting with coaching as opposed to this minimal support and delivering the daily message. The reason I think there's a positive synergy is because, think about it, if I start with coaching here, I can increase supportive accountability and therapeutic alliance, which can increase engagement with the messages, with the digital message. So if I start with coaching, on average, the message is going to be more effective in reducing next day substance use because it's going to be more engaging. That's my hypothesis, but how do I test it? What kind of trial do I need to answer this question? You see, to answer this question and other questions that I have about how to construct this multimodal adaptive intervention, I actually need a trial design that will allow me to randomize participants sequentially to human-delivered components on a slow time scale and to digital components on a fast time scale all together in the same trial. Because I want to look at the synergy, the interaction between these components. And this is what hybrid designs do. Hybrid designs is just a trial that involves sequential randomizations. But it's special because it allows you to randomize on multiple timescales, slow and fast. For example, this is a hybrid experimental design that combines the SMART that I showed you earlier with the MRT that I showed you earlier. You see? I'm randomizing first to the intervention with or without coaching, then I'm re-randomizing non-responders to either step up or continue, and responders continue. But at the same time, every day, I'm collecting data about the person's state and context, and I'm micro-randomizing to message versus no message. I'm randomizing on 2 time scales: slow to human-delivered components and fast to the digital components. But how do I use data from this trial? It looks very complex. How do I use it to answer the question about the synergy? To show you how to do that, I actually want to start by showing you how to answer 2 simpler questions, okay? And I want you to be in the following mindset. Suppose that I conducted this study, and I collected the data. And I'm actually interested in 2 outcomes here. A distal outcome, week 16 substance use, and a proximal outcome, next day substance use. I'm interested in both. Let's just assume that, okay? All right, conducted the study, collected the data, cleaned it up, everything works perfect. I sit in front of the computer. The first thing that I want to do with the data when I analyze it is to answer the following question. Is it better to start my multi-model adaptive intervention with or without coaching? Is it more beneficial to start with coaching overall in terms of week 16 substance use, my distal outcome? How do I answer this question? In the same way that you answer this question when you only had the SMART. Again, you take the mean outcome across the 3 cells, mean outcome week 16 substance use, across the 3 cells in which participants did not start with coaching, compare it to the 3 cells in which they started with coaching. Bless you. That's it. 2-arm comparison. Same type of analysis, but there's always a but. The interpretation of the effect will be different. Now, this is the main effect of starting with coaching versus no coaching. Not only averaging over the second stage components for responders and non-responders, but also averaging over the delivery of the daily messages because you have the MRT in the background. You're in the multi-model adaptive intervention context. Does that make sense? It's just the interpretation that is different. The analysis is exactly the same. Now, suppose the second thing that I want to do with the data is figure out if in my multi-model adaptive intervention, on average, sending a message with a protective behavioral strategy is beneficial in reducing next day substance use. Guess what you do? The same analysis that you do when you don't have the SMART. When you only have the MRT, take the mean outcome, next day substance use across all the days in which a message was sent, across all participants, compare it to the mean outcome across all the days in which a message was not sent, across all participants. Same analysis. But the interpretation now is different because you had the SMART in the background. Now, this is the average main effect of delivering a message versus no message on next day substance use, where you're not only averaging over all the participants and all the days in which they were micro-randomized, you're also averaging over the first stage and second stage randomizations in the SMART. Does that make sense? So I think now you know how to answer the question about the synergy, because you know how to analyze the data to estimate the proximal effect of delivering a message versus no message on next day substance use. Remember, the question about the synergy was, does this effect, can I strengthen this effect by starting with coaching? This effect meaning the effect of delivering versus not delivering a message on next day substance use. So what do I need to do? I need to estimate this effect within the 3 cells in which participants did not start with coaching. Then estimate this effect within the 3 cells in which participants started with coaching and compare the 2. It's kind of like a 2-way interaction. You see that? Interaction between starting with coaching versus no coaching and delivering a message versus not delivering a message. Difference between differences. And this interaction will tell me if the effect of delivering a message on next day substance use compared to doing nothing, if it's amplified for those who started with coaching versus no coaching. You see that? It's quite simple, actually. The analysis for these designs is not complex. The analysis for MRTs is not complex. But I can tell you what is complex. Getting the data cleaned up and managed in such a way that you can conduct these analyses. That's the challenging part. All right, this manuscript provides an introduction to a hybrid design that integrates the SMART and the MRT. it includes a few tables with many scientific questions that these designs can help you answer about constructing multi-model adaptive interventions. This manuscript also has supplements with code that you can use to analyze the data and code that you can use to plan sample size for these trials. This manuscript provides an introduction to other types of hybrid designs, such as the one that we talked about yesterday, hybrid, factorial, and the SMART. So check it out if you're interested. It also includes code that you can use to analyze the data. We still haven't figured out the sample size, still working on it. This one provides an introduction to hybrid designs with examples in HIV. It's motivated by work that I've been doing with an amazing colleague of mine, Sylvie Nahr. All right, so that's as far as I can go. Okay, can I take 5 minutes for questions? Is that okay?
Yeah, we have
Yeah?
a 10-minute break now, so you can.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
You're making, when you average across a second stage intervention, you're making this really significant assumption that the effect of the digital randomization is equivalent across all of the cells within each of those second stage groupings.
No,
Because
not
you're
that the
averaging-
effect, yeah, I'm averaging, but not that the effect is equivalent.
Well, if you're averaging over them, then it's impossible to know whether one of the second stage randomizations is interacting with the digital component.
Good point. Very good point. That's why, in addition to looking at the main effect, I also usually look at interactions. If you think that there's a strong interaction there, then it makes sense to look at the interaction.
But then you need to be powered to do that.
Yes. If there's a very strong interaction and you anticipate this interaction right off the bat, then and you think that this would undermine the main effect, definitely you should power for that interaction.
But then there's a further sort of similar assumption, which is you can average across the fast randomizations. Because it could be, for example, that someone who has 2 days in a row where they get no message is either more or less likely to then, or, maybe whatever, there's a whole bunch of permutations.
Absolutely. That's why there are a whole bunch of permutations, but I can tell you from my experience designing these trials that some of them you can anticipate based on existing scientific evidence and theories, and you can plan the analysis to actually look at these interactions. And of course, there's so many things that you don't know, but then you can have exploratory aims, right? To look at the data and all the permutations. That makes a lot of sense. But by the way, let me tell you something really interesting about the assumptions. Because some people say, oh, when you're looking at a main effect, you're actually making so many assumptions about what you're averaging over. And then I'm thinking about standard randomized controlled trials, where just people compare intervention package 1 with a digital intervention to intervention package 2 without a digital intervention. And the analytic approach is an intent to treat approach, right? It's the treatment that you assign people for, not the treatment they actually got. And so many things happen in this trial that we're not controlling. Some people stop using the devices, they go to the doctor, they give them something else. Some people use a different app, completely replace what you recommended. All kinds of things happen. If you're lucky, you collect information about that. If you're not lucky, you don't. But you're averaging over all of it. You're ignoring everything that happened in the course of the conduct of the trial. The advantage here is that I'm not ignoring it. I'm actually controlling for it by design in many ways. I have control over how do you assess response status. I have control over the second stage treatments, and I have control as much as possible over the type of prompts that people get. And I think that's a huge advantage. It helps me feel more comfortable with this assumption as opposed to standard randomized control trials. Does that make sense?
I'm not sure I 100% agree, but it does make sense.
We can agree to disagree. That's okay too. Yeah.
So you said one of the harder parts of this whole hybrid design is setting up the data for the analysis.
Oh yeah.
And then you said you have R code for the analyses. How do you
I do.
Like help for like the data
I do. Actually, I was hoping you would ask this question. Jamie is not here. Jamie is our data analyst, but is Lauren here? Lauren is not here. Lauren is another amazing data analyst. Both of them are amazing. Have been working with us for the past few years. And what they're doing is pretty much any micro-randomized trial or hybrid design that we analyze, they develop templates that investigators can use to curate and manage the data and integrate the data. And we put everything online. So right now, I think we have online guides for how to curate and manage data from about 4 micro-randomized trials. So check it out. I think it looks like it's really helping investigators who are interested in this trial, because there are at least 2 or 3 groups that are currently relying on these templates to analyze their data. All right, one last question before we move on. Yeah.
Is it ever a problem if your clustering is cross-classified during analysis?
Tell me more. What do you mean?
So I often am collecting diary data with intro college students in a STEM course. So I have these responses nested within students, but they're all taking the same course, so they're also nested within the same week because they experience the same activity.
Yeah, I haven't gotten this far, actually. It's a good direction to take, like thinking about nesting structure for data that comes from MRT. I know that Walter Dempsey has done some work in this direction, looking at proximal effects when the responses are clustered within, I think in his case it was cohorts, different cohorts of physicians or interns. But there's still a lot that we have to do in this, to make it multi-level. And I know that over there, you had a question before, and I told you that I'm not so sure we're gonna have time. Do you remember what you wanted to ask? It's okay if not. That's okay. You can come get me. All right. Thank you, everybody. Really appreciate it. Take 10 minutes break. We'll figure out the schedule, okay?